is Taft. I'm Head of Collections at the Postal Museum, and we're here in Mail Row and part of the Postal Museum visitor experience. And we're stood in front of the switch frame. This is the original 1927 switch frame that was used to control the station at Mount Pleasant and the sections of track either side of it. So basically the way the control in Mail Row worked from the beginning, from 1927 when it first opened, was that it was an automatic driverless system. So a series of relays would control the trains and move the train from section to section. So the blue diagram above is not from 1927, it's a slightly modern version, but the same thing, and it shows on there each section. Perhaps see at the top left hand side it says EA7, and that's an example.
It's the first track, yes.
That's the first track at the top. And you can see that each of those sections there are the sections that the train would move through. Now when a train was moving between the stations, it was completely automatic, and it would move from one section to the next section without interference or control from any sort of controller. But it worked on a dead section principle. So a section that was occupied with a live moving train, the section either side of it would be devoid of power so that no train could catch up with, ultimately crash into, another train. So as the train moved from one section to another, the section of track either side of it would be cut off power, and the train would then sort of move, in theory, move sort of smoothly from one section to the next. If it was to catch up with another train and try to enter a section that was a train in the section in front of, it would lose power, the train brakes would be applied, the train would come to a stop, and would only be energised again once the train cleared the section in front of that. Within the station sections and in the sections either side of the station, it was controlled by a switch frame, such as the switch frame we have in front of us here. So as the trains moved into the station area, a controller of this panel would be able to move trains from section to section. So the levers across the front of this panel have their sort of explanation above as to what they do. So they would take the train and they would move it from one section to another. So you can see shunt from WP3 to WL, shunt from WP2 to WL, and that all correlates to the diagram that was then above the controllers, front control above their head, basically. So they would be working basically exactly the same as a signal frame on a mainline railway with sort of big levers that would be pulled out. This is the same but on a much smaller scale. Mount Pleasant was the biggest and most complicated station in the network, so it was central to the network, it was in the middle of the network, and trains at Mount Pleasant would be able to be moved from various sections, would be crossed over at possible 3 different crossover points on this platform area, also be sent into sidings, and also be sent up to the car depot, which is where we are now. So the switch frame at Mount Pleasant was far longer than the switch frame at any other station. All of the stations had switch frames, and the switch frames were in little cabins between the platforms. It's an island style platform, the east and west bound track either side, and the cabin sat in the centre of the platform area, and this switch frame sat inside that cabin. And this is where the controller would stand and operate these levers in order to direct the trains. Once the train left its section, it then was under automatic control, moving through the tunnel to the next section, the next station area, where the controller in the next station would take over control of the train through their station. On a frame exactly the same as this, but much smaller, generally about half the length of this one.
How many control frames were there on your network?
There were, it varied actually, and it changed throughout the time. So originally there were 6 stations on the line, but that changed as time moved on. 2 of the stations were closed down, a new station was built and a switch frame was added for that. Then some of the stations were combined, so King Edward Building was closed down, for example, and its operation combined with Mount Pleasant. And the switch frame from there was moved to Mount Pleasant. And then in the 1990s, a computerised system overtook that, so this was essentially became completely redundant in the mid-1990s and no longer did anything. and the computer control took over. So I suppose there were maybe 6 to 8 switch frames at the peak of operation, but a number of them were combined, and 2 of the stations were very, very small and didn't have their own.
And was this entirely looked after by the post office's own engineers?
Totally, yeah. It was post office engineers. So there was there was a number of different, lots of different roles on the railway, but effectively the sort of role fell into the job fell into 2 halves really. There was the postal half, which was the postal workers who were loading the trains. So they were postal workers, much like the postal workers that would have been up in the main sorting offices sorting post. They would be down on the platform loading the mail into the trains. And then there were the engineering staff who were purely there as engineers, train engineers. And the engineers on mail rail, on the post office railway as it was historically called, were dedicated engineers to that railway. So many of them trained as electrical engineers or mechanical engineers in other areas. Many of them were kind of processing, Royal Mail would call processing engineers, so dealing with sorting machines and things like that, and they would transfer over to the railway. But once they worked on the railway, they were exclusively working on the railway.
Who installed the original control equipment?
So it was installed under contract by the post office. So a lot of the equipment came from English Electric. Exactly what company installed it all, I don't know. That I don't think there's any record exactly of it. I've never seen it if there is. But English Electric were the principal supplier of most of the electrical equipment for the railway at the time. But the electrical system was designed by the chief electrical engineer for the post office, Charles Gunton, who was the chief electrical engineer for the post office. So it was all designed and built by the post office, by the postal service itself.
Lever frame at Mount Pleasant, and using these levers the operator can select any train movement that he likes. He can receive, send and jump trains from one platform to another. These lights will tell him the location of the trains. When they go red, the section's occupied. When they go green, it's clear. The levers work on a 6 position system, the first position being in the frame and the 6th position being all fully out and power placed on the train. They're interlocked in their first position mechanically so that no 2 levers that conflict with one another can be pulled. They're pulled to the 2nd position, which will then check that the route the train is going to travel over is clear. You then pull them to the 4th position, which will operate any points necessary for that train movement to be made. When the points have been proven to have thrown, it will be released and pulled into the 6th position, which will power the train. When he's seen that the train movement's been completed, he can then push from the 6th position into the 5th, which will disconnect power from the train and check that the route has been completed, that the train has actually cleared the sections it went over. It will then move into the 3rd position, which will operate the points to set them back to normal, and then once that's been proven to have occurred, the lever was free to go into the 1st position and the train movement is deemed as being completed.
What it tries to do is simulate the movement of the trains. So I think a lot of them is stuck on the train.
Only one lever can be used at a time. So to begin, make sure they are all placed in the neutral positions.
Ah, yes, the first train just there, isn't it?
Yeah. So this kind of replicates the way
That it worked.
that it would work in quite a simplistic way. It does tend to suffer from a
Stick
bit
up, yeah. That's use, that is, isn't it?
Yeah, it does.
But you mentioned on the reel frame in the video, it mentioned you've got several positions on it, so you've got almost a check position to make sure that the section in front is clear and safe, and then you can move it to the latter positions before it finally clears.
Yeah.
Likewise, when the frame is going back, obviously you can't just put levers all the way back. They have to go to a check position to prove that everything's gone, the route has been taken by the train.
Yeah, exactly.
This is quite nice. I like this. It's giving people a chance to see how that works
and to relate how that works in a sort of in a way that's perhaps understandable to people who are not sigma-cheers.
And you mentioned there's a gentleman, the system that took over from this, the Vaughan computer system, the gentleman involved in that only lives around the corner, he knows how it all works, and he'll help take it apart.
He helped take it apart. He also helped us in our understanding of it in terms of the interpretation that we put around and explain it, and how we developed this. Really, it was him explaining how it worked that allowed us to understand, how to create an interactive version for our visitors.
Now, signalling wise, obviously these were they weren't passenger transport; they were mail transport. You switched sections off in front of the mail cars. What was actually switched off? The voltage to the tracks that fed them, and what was the voltage on the tracks?
In the running sections between stations, it was 440 direct current. So in the station areas, it dropped down to 150 DC in order to slow the trains down.
Right.
So trains were slowed down in two ways and stopped in a third way. So it was slowed down first of all by, as they entered the station section, trains would come up a slight gradient. So that alone would slow them down. The power was then dropped from 440 DC to 150 DC, which further slowed the trains down. And that was partly for safety and partly obviously also to make sure they could then stop the trains when they were in the stations. Once the train had reached the point against the platform that it was meant to stop at, the power was cut from that section, and the train, as the power was cut, the braking solenoid inside the motor unit of the train itself would drop onto the brake, drop the pads onto the brakes, and bring the train to a stop. As soon as that train got power again, that brake would lift off, and the power, 440 volts, would kick the train off, get it moving. It would run at 150 through the station section. It would reach the other end of the station to leave. It would go down a slope instead of up the slope, which would increase its speed, and then it would pick up 440 off the central third rail, moving on to the next station where the same thing happened again.
So all the mail rail cars, they were similar to this one? This is an early one?
This is an early one. There's a later example here, and you can see perhaps at the front there, just underneath the shoe,
Yes.
pickup shoe, that
there.
would have touched the conrail that would have brought the power onto the train.
So effectively, your normal wheels act as a return back to the supply.
Yeah.
How often did the service run? When did it start? When did it stop?
It was running basically most of the day. It ran at the peak of its operation, and it did change over time. So from its opening in 1927 right through to the sort of late 1990s, really, the late 1990s, it was running sort of 22 hours a day. The 2 hours it wasn't running for was between 8 and 10 in the morning, and that's when it was closed down for maintenance purposes. So it was staffed 24 hours a day. So for the 2 hours when it wasn't running carrying post, that's when the engineers would come on site, undertake checks, track checks, and check P-way, check the routes, and check all of the sort of systems, and undertake any maintenance works. The rest of the time it was in use, moving the mail around, because it was needed, and it was a very busy system. So if you were stood somewhere like the station at Mount Pleasant, and this is the depot at Mount Pleasant, and the station itself, if you were stood there, you would see a train coming in roughly every 6 minutes.
It's quite a lot of trains. How many of your train cars operated on the system?
There were about 35 of these cars in total, about 18 in use at any one time. So some of them were
Always spare or maintenance.
Maintenance. This was the maintenance depot, so some of them were brought up here. It was a 10,000 mile service. There's a little clock inside them that logs the hours they've run. So every 10,000 miles they'll be brought up here for servicing, and then obviously brought up here if they develop a fault and things as well.
It's quite a lot of running for 10,000 miles.
Yeah. So all the points in the depot were manually operated. So the purpose of the depot was a maintenance workshop. Essentially, it was an engineering workshop. So the trains were brought up from the network itself. There's a set of tracks just on the other side of this wall. The trains would have come up into the depot, powered by the third rail in the same way as they were when they were in operation. As they came into the depot, they lost the third rail, and after that they would come to a stop in the area just at the top of what we call the incline, around the other side there. Come to a stop there, and from there they would be plugged in to power from above. So this cable that you can see here would plug into the front of the trains, giving the train power. And then this would be controlled from these tram controller type setup on this podium up here. So there are 3 controllers, 2 on this side, 1 on the other side, controlling 3 trolleys connected to the train. So to move the train around the depot, it would be sitting on the track still, but it would be moved, and underneath this raised floor are a range of tracks. So the train would come up here, powered and plugged into that cabling at the far end over there, moved along to here. The points would be manually operated with the lever pulled up to switch the track to be run onto the next set of tracks to be taken, for example, down on this side, where it would be unplugged from that dolly and plugged into this one, and they were taken then down on the tracks on this side, for example, possibly running down this set of tracks here, in order to run it up to the brake testing area that was down the far end there, or it could be crossed over onto the tracks where our train is currently sat down there, that would allow it to go into the over the inspection pit, so it could be accessed from underneath to access the motors underneath and the brakes underneath, or ultimately taken down onto the very far side track, which would allow it to go right down the end of the depot through what is now a black metal shutter door that once upon a time wasn't there, and that would have taken you out to a shaft, a vertical shaft that had a hoist above it, which would allow trains to be lifted in or out of the depot. So that's how all the trains were delivered. They were all lowered in through that access shaft, placed directly onto the track, and then moved around the depot in the way. So each station on the line had a different shape to represent it. So when you were handing over, because each station controlled its own section, if you were handing over from one engineer to another engineer to a different section, in order to know that you were safe and that there was no danger of anybody starting the trains up, you would take the key out of the centre with the key fob attached, the key gets attached, and you would hand that key over to the engineer at the other station. But because the tunnels were often completely dark, because it wasn't built for people, the hole in the centre allowed you to put your finger in the hole, feel the shape of the key fob to work out to know you had the right key, so somebody wasn't giving you the wrong key. So Mount Pleasant was a triangular shaped key, so that key had a triangular shape in it, and different, as I say, different stations had different shapes, so you always knew which key you had, even if you couldn't see it and see the writing on it. The Postal Museum, designed by us for our use. So we have 2 trains, and they're battery powered, driver operated. So unlike the original rail, which was driverless, these are driver operated. So there's a driver cabin at each end. So this train will leave here. It will more or less immediately cross over onto the other track on the left-hand side and run down this hill into the network itself. And if we have a little look at this map up here, it will show more clearly what happens. So it leaves the depot. It comes onto this bit of track illustrated red here, and it comes round this section. At this point it splits, the track splits, and it takes this left-hand tunnel and then comes alongside this platform. This was technically the eastbound platform back in the day when the railway operated. It nowadays stops against this platform, and a projection plays for visitors to watch and learn a little bit about the railway and its history. It then moves on and goes on to this green section, goes round this loop, and then comes back along the other side of the platform where it stops again, and another projection plays for visitors to see. And then after that it comes back along here, back into this blue section here, where it joins the track back to where it came from, but this time on the opposite track, so that it then comes back round here and back up to the depot. So where the driver left the depot at this end, the driver returned to the depot at that end.
When it says extract enabled, what does...
That's for the smoke extraction.
Ah, right, yes.
For purposes of fire and things like that.
So is this fully automated, or does it require someone to manually keep an eye on it during the day?
It's automated. So this is switched off at the moment because we're closed, but this is the signalling system that we use. So basically you can see just in front of the train there on the track there's a
little inducer. Yes?
And so that is what triggers the signals.
Right.
So you can see we've got a red light
Just down on there in the end.
So that's because the system's switched off at the moment, so it's all set to red. But when this train leaves the depot, it passes over one of these triggers. It crosses over on that set of points just down there. It goes down, it passes over another, and there's a whole. These perform two functions basically. These obviously indicate the location of the train, which is fed onto this computer system here, and that does two things. One, it tells us where the trains are and operates the signals. There's 3 sets of lights around the network in order to stop one of our trains catching up with the other one of our trains and ultimately colliding with it. And it also triggers the AV. So as the train goes along, that sends a signal to this system, which sends a signal to a system up in a room up at the back up there,
Yes.
which then says play this show now. It also sends a signal to this panel, and all this panel does is tells us at any one time where the trains are on the network, and that's only for use in an emergency. If there was, heaven forbid, a fire, these switches would allow us to switch extract fans on, running in the appropriate direction. The last thing you want to do is blow smoke towards a train full of people, so you would need to know where the train is in order to know which direction to operate the fans.
And you mentioned the firm that installed this system was called?
PBE, the system.
PBE.
What that stands for, I couldn't tell you, but PBE was the name of the company. I think they're ultimately a Canadian-owned company, but they were the company that installed this system. But we now maintain it with other companies.
Do you have a form of ship-to-shore radio to the drivers?
We have a leaky feeder, coaxial radio.
Yeah, so wherever you are, you can still pick that
Yes,
up.
that
that side
works
of it.
across the whole site. So that works on our main museum site over the road, and it works here. So yeah, our drivers are in. So the way we operate essentially here is we have a driver in the train, and the driver in the train is responsible for the train and for their passengers at all times. And then we always have a controller here as well. So the train will not operate if there's not a controller here. So the controller is keeping an eye on what's going on the screen. Is here to sort of offer assistance and guidance to the driver if they need it. On a more practical basis, they're here to sort of trigger AVs if they don't trigger themselves and things like that. So they control that all from an iPad on the desk there. So we can operate and make the show repeat itself if we needed it to or anything like that. But they're also here from a safety role. So they're here if there was a problem, a passenger takes ill or somebody needs to get out.
They're here for that.
Emergency, they are in charge. So I suppose they're the equivalent of your signal operator really for our railway essentially. So they're here in a safety role.
And how many passengers does the car normally carry?
Roughly, I mean, it very much depends on how busy we are, it depends on the makeup of passengers. As you can see, the compartments are quite small.
They are, yes.
So if you're here a family group of 3, you're probably quite comfortable if you've got maybe 2 adults and a child. If you're here with a group of friends and there's 6, larger people,
carriage.
adults and stuff like that, then you get far fewer. I mean, really you're looking at sort of 22 would be a fully loaded carriage. If that's made up of a good mix of children and adults. If it was all children, you can get more than that. If it's all adults, less than that.
And at night, they all go back on charge?
They go on charge most nights, I think. They're on charge now, one of them is anyway. But the driver team sort of deal with all that nowadays.
So is it the same kind of maintenance regime as with the older system? Do you have to do maintenance every 10,000 miles or so?
It's similar, yeah. I mean, it's not quite in the same way, but we have... we are actually operated under the ADIPS scheme that operates amusement rides and attractions. It's a very, very long and quite interesting possibly, but it's certainly a long story about the enforcing authority for this sort of visitor attraction. So this is not classified technically as a railway, it's a ride.
Yes.
So it's governed under the rules of the enforcing authority of the Health and Safety Executive, not the Office of Rail Regulation.